Well, thank you guys for having me. The last few days I've spent with family in Auckland and Wellington. In no way ever growing up did I ever think I would be standing in New Zealand on a stage talking about organic, following someone from Massey who has just downloaded the most horrific information about cancer. So I kind of feel like everybody probably needs to take a deep breath. My mother is from New Zealand. She was a nurse with Save the Children in Vietnam, where she met my dad, who is in the U.S. Army. From the beginning, I don't know if you can see the bib, but it says I'm a Kiwi baby. She made sure that we had lamb every Sunday after church. She made sure that I could cook a pavlova. And when I told her I had been invited to this conference, she was absolutely beside herself thrilled. My aunt and uncle are in Auckland, all my cousins are there. Another aunt is in Wellington. She was headmistress of Chilton and Marsden. My godmother is a farmer in Palmerston North. And as I listened to your talk about cancer, I thought about her. She is a breast cancer survivor. She has 3 daughters. One of her daughters is also a cancer survivor. She used glyphosate after her husband suffered a heart attack when he was 42. And she used it religiously. And as I was learning and moving into this space, I kept saying, maybe not, could you maybe not? She really had no other way to manage the weeds on that farm. And it wasn't until the World Health Organization and the IARC came out in 2015 and said, this is a probable human carcinogen, that she finally stopped. So to be here today, it's really personal. We don't have a conference like this in the US. We have a massive industry trade show in March every year in California. And it's the organic food industry and the very shelf-focused place. We don't have the farmers there. We don't talk about soil, we don't talk about immigration, we don't talk about health insurance for our farmers. We need this conference there. So I'm kind of going to push Jonathan a little bit on that, how we can begin to have this conversation in other countries beyond New Zealand. I grew up in Houston, Texas. I went to business school on a full scholarship. I was recruited by the oil and gas industry in Houston, Texas. I get bored really easily, and so I joined a team that managed $20 billion in assets. And as the only female on the team, the guy said, you can cover the food industry. And I just thought, you have got the wrong person. I did not eat clean. I did not eat organic. I drank diet soda probably 6 times a day. Coca-Cola has a term for people like me back then. They call us heavy users. I was a heavy user. And so it's so unlikely to be here today. I loved that job. I loved that job. But when we were pregnant with our first child, my husband got an offer in Colorado, and we agreed to move out to Boulder, Colorado. I felt like I had landed on a different planet. Everybody was talking about organic, and I thought, this is some like hippy-dippy thing, lifestyle of the rich and famous. What is going on here? And we just sort of settled in, and I thought, I want to go back into finance. I want to go back into investment. So if we're going to have a family, we're going to do it really fast. So we had 4 children in 5 years. Not twins anywhere in there either. And when our youngest child was about 1 morning over breakfast, she had an allergic reaction. I'd met the management teams from Goldman Sachs when they were taking their companies public, Martha Stewart, when she was taking her company public. I really couldn't cook, and I used to say scrambled eggs were about as Martha Stewart as I could get. And that morning over breakfast in January of 2006, I'd fed the kids scrambled eggs. And so my little one started to get fussy, and she started kind of rubbing her face, and I thought she must be tired. I took her out of the high chair and put her upstairs in her crib, and I still, to this day, do not know why I went and checked on her. She was my 4th child. Usually you just let them sleep. But for some reason that morning, I went back upstairs, and her face was swollen shut. And I turned to the older 3, and I said, what did you put in her face? And they all gave me those really blank little kid stares where they're telling the truth. They had no idea what I was talking about. So I raced her to the pediatrician. And she said, Robyn, this looks like an allergic reaction. And I said, what are you talking about? And she said, well, what did you feed the kids for breakfast? especially to you guys, this audience, I had fed the kids blue yogurt, Lego My Eggo waffles, and scrambled eggs. And she said, well, those are 3 of the top 8 allergens here in the US. And this looks like an allergic reaction. So as we got her under control and everything settled down, and I brought her home and I got her down for a nap, all of that analytical skill set in me just went off. And I wanted to understand what was happening with food allergies in America. The thing is, when you're looking for that information, much like you just demonstrated, it's not all neatly tucked into one place. You can't just go to one agency and pull a file on food allergies in America. Today, 2 children in every classroom in the United States have a food allergy. From 1997 until 2007, there was a 265% increase in the rate of food allergies in America. Your likelihood of developing food allergies increases if you move to America. And as I was digging into this information, I learned that 1 in 3 children in the US now have what are called the 4 A's: allergies, asthma, ADHD, or autism. But the thing is, when you're looking for this information again, you don't just get to selectively pull information on food allergies. What I learned is that this generation of children in the United States has earned the nickname Generation RX because cancer is the leading cause of death by disease in American children under the age of 15. I had 4 children under the age of 5 when I learned that. And I would go to the playground with them, and I would look at these kids knowing this data. 1 in 10 has asthma, 1 in 13 has food allergies, the rates of autism have skyrocketed. If you think back to when the movie Rain Man was released, it was a novelty because we were not familiar yet with autism. And I would stand on that playground and I would look at these kids and I would think, oh my gosh, what happens next? What happens with statistics like this? We spend more on drugs than any other country on the planet, by a lot. It is a shocking number. In the United States, sickness sells. Little was done to introduce the precautionary principle. Little was done in terms of prevention. Part of the reason I am here as a dual citizen is to sound that warning bell before it hits here. Cancer growth tends to happen before the growth of the organic industry. Don't wait. Do not wait. 1 in 2 men in the United States are expected to get cancer in their lifetime, and 1 in 3 women. 1 in 8 women, including my godmother here, is expected to get breast cancer in her lifetime. But what I learned is that only 1 in 10 of those breast cancer cases are genetic, which means 9 out of 10 breast cancers are non-genetic or environmentally triggered. And as I was learning this, all anybody was talking about was obesity. And I thought, 1 in 2 men? What are we waiting for, 1 in 1? Before we start talking about this? And what can be done to exercise prevention? If you look at healthcare spending in the United States versus any other country, it is almost 3 times as much. That number is now almost $10,000 a year. New Zealand's right around $3,300. It hits right at the average. The economic impact, 20 cents of every dollar spent in the United States is now spent on disease management and healthcare costs. When I ask an audience, is that how you want to be spending your money? Nobody says yes. The conversations we had yesterday at Parliament were discussing building a National Cancer Institute here in New Zealand. My advice, build the organic industry first. So as I was unearthing and unpacking this information, I mean, it is heavy stuff. You've just heard another presentation of really heavy stuff. And I'm an optimist, and I kept trying to sort of search and hope that there might be some data point or some nugget that was positive. And having been raised in Houston, Texas, in a really conservative family, I was trying to secure conservative data points and conservative sources. The CIA is about as conservative as you can get, and they rank life expectancy at birth. I know you guys have had the encounter with the typical American that's pretty boastful and proud, and I thought, if the CIA is ranking life expectancy at birth, surely the US, one of the most developed countries in the world, is going to be in the top 10. So I start scrolling down this list. We're not in the top 10. We're not in the top 20. We're not in the top 30. We're not even in the top 40. We hover around 48 or 50. We kind of move right in that area with countries like Bahrain for how our children are going to fare. So I spent probably a summer wrestling with this. And all I could think was, what's changed? So I set up the system I had set up when I had been an analyst at the desk, and I started to hit terms and data points and things that I wanted to capture so that every morning when I woke up, I kind of had this stack of emails in my inbox that were relative to food allergies and the growth of food allergies. And one morning in October of 2006, a headline hit, and the title of the article was, "Do Genetically Engineered Foods Cause Food Allergies?" And I thought, what's a genetically engineered food? I'd cover the food industry, we'd never talked about it. And into this article, I was covering a small EPA grant that had been issued, $440,000, to a university in Michigan. And so I picked up the phone and I called this guy in Michigan. I said, I have a mother of 4, I've got this finance background, I don't have the science background. So fill me in on what you're doing. And he said, well, we have no long-term human studies here, and there were no animal testing models that were conducted. So when we introduced genetically engineered foods in the mid-1990s, we're really trying to figure out how that process may have created additional allergens. And in some cases, created these pieces and parts that are floating in there that we don't really even have names for yet. And I was like, wait, back up. I said, we introduced genetically engineered ingredients into our food supply in the 1990s. And he said, yes. And I said, well, why wasn't that labeled? He didn't know. My mother, as a New Zealander, always raised me with this question. She said, just because Houston or Texas is doing it this way does not mean the world's doing it this way. And just because we're doing it this way here in the States doesn't mean that's how everybody else is doing it. So I instantly thought, how is everybody else doing it? As these foreign invaders were introduced into the food system, they were inserted with a gene gun. That blast, some scientists were concerned, might create what they were calling genetic rubble. As these foreign ingredients were inserted into the food system, it made a ton of sense when you thought about who was doing it. A few weeks later, out fell a company that I had not heard of at the time, called Monsanto. And I picked up the phone and I called one of the guys and I said, why, if I covered the food industry, did I not know about Monsanto? And he said, well, that's a chemical company, Robyn. The guys that were covering the chemical industry covered that. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And the first introduction of a genetically engineered product into the U.S. food system was an artificial growth hormone called RBGH. It was inserted into our dairy cows to help them make more milk. It made a lot of sense economically. You can't argue against a bigger supply, hopefully bringing down the cost of milk for American families and families around the world. The problem is that the U.S. was the only developed country in the world to allow this ingredient into its food system, into its dairy, into its cheese, its milk, its ice cream, its yogurt, because it made the cows really sick. It caused clinical lameness, increased mastitis, ovarian cysts, and it resulted in an increased antibiotic use in the animals. 80% of the antibiotics used in the United States are used on the animals we eat. So I'm sitting there thinking, how many sippy cups did I put this milk in? How many bowls of cereal have I poured it on? The grief I felt sitting there with my 4th child that night was tremendous, and I did not want to know more. And I remember looking at the kids in the backyard one day just thinking, what have I done? What do I do with this information? And I asked my parents, I said, I don't know what to do with what I'm learning. And my dad said, you're supposed to do nothing. And I understand now that was coming from a place of a parent protecting his child from what he perceived to be an enormous risk and harm. But when you look at these charts and you look at the business model that Monsanto introduced, if you were a board member on that company, you would be saying, well done. They sold that weed killer Roundup prior to the introduction of genetically engineered foods. With the introduction of genetically engineered foods, this is USDA data, it skyrocketed. The use of glyphosate since the 1990s has absolutely skyrocketed in the United States. So I stepped back and I thought, what about other countries? The US and Canada are only two of the developed countries in the entire world that do not label these ingredients. Consumers in these countries are not allowed to make an informed choice. Judgment aside, science aside, a fundamental shift had happened in agriculture, and we in the United States were not told, and our products that we feed our children were not labeled. And around the world, everybody else was told. This is the introduction of glyphosate from 1992 at the advent of genetically engineered crops all the way until recently. 13,000 lawsuits have been filed in the United States. 3 have already gone to court, and Monsanto has lost all 3. The first one happened in August of 2018. It was a groundskeeper named Lee Johnson. No one expected him to win. But in the discovery stages, what started to come out was that in 1985, when our EPA was first reviewing glyphosate and whether or not it was a probable human carcinogen, in 1985, the United States EPA said, yes, glyphosate is a probable human carcinogen. In 1991, just before the introduction of genetically engineered crops that are referred to as Roundup Ready crops, Roundup Ready soy, Roundup Ready corn. 6 years later, the United States EPA reversed that decision and said it's safe. The most recent lawsuit was a couple, exactly the kind of exposure that you were just talking about. They were awarded $2 billion in damages. And when Bayer acquired Monsanto a couple of years ago, they paid $63 billion. The outgoing CEO had not wanted to make the acquisition because of the litigation and because of the risk. He was let go, a new guy was brought in. The new guy was able to greenlight the acquisition by not taking it to a shareholder vote. He financed the whole thing with cash to circumvent his shareholders. He paid $63 billion in cash. It's the largest cash transaction ever on record for the banks. Since then, since these verdicts starting in August, Bayer has lost 43% of its share price, and it is now worth less than what it paid for Monsanto. It has a market cap of $55 billion. So as I was stepping back from this, I thought, there was this promise here. There was a promise that this was going to feed the world. There was a promise to American farmers that this was going to be a more efficient way to farm. Those promises were false and misleading claims. They have not fed the world. 40% of the food that we produce, according to the United States Department of Agriculture and the United Nations, is thrown away or wasted. We don't have a production problem, we have a distribution problem. And I kept coming back to this question. Are we allergic to food, or what's been done to it? Because these top 8 allergens, things like soy, wheat, dairy, eggs. We're starting to be married to other allergens like beef, chicken, and people started to ask, are we allergic to beef that we ate or our grandmothers ate 80 years ago? Are we allergic to this beef that's fed this genetically engineered food and then hopped up on a bunch of antibiotics? We are part of that live human trial in the United States right now. So again, that voice of my mother, I stepped back and I thought, I was really lucky to travel here a lot as a kid to see my family here. And I thought about these US food companies and I thought, okay, if they're using these products here in the US, what are they doing in these countries that don't allow them or require them to be labeled? Because they're not going to want the liability once it's labeled, because those labels bring liability, accountability, traceability. It's the last thing these companies want. And I realized they were formulating their products differently for consumers in other countries. And it was really in that moment that I knew I had to say something. And I did not want to. It was way before anyone was talking about genetically engineered foods. You mentioned the term GMOs and people looked at you like you had 3 heads in America. I had no idea how I could possibly speak to this subject in a way that would help people listen. And people kept saying, you're like Erin Brockovich, you should reach out to Erin Brockovich. And I thought, I'm a mom of 4 in Colorado with 4 little kids under my knees. How am I going to reach out to Erin Brockovich? But I thought I had to at least try. And so I spent about 2 weeks crafting this 4-sentence email to Erin Brockovich. And I sent it off right at Christmas of 2006. And I think I sent it because I knew I just had to do something. And within a couple of days, she replied. And she said, I am so glad someone is taking this on. I lost my brother when he was 38 years old to a food allergic reaction. It was in that moment I knew that I had to do something. At the time, I had been introduced to a friend who ran a global advertising agency. He was getting super passionate on all this food stuff. He was learning about all these different contaminations. A friend of ours, a mutual friend, said, you guys got to get together. And he said, I really want to have you on this web show that I do. And I was like, Alex, how are you going to have me on that show? I mean, your clients are Domino's, Pepsi, Kraft. He said, no, I'll have you on the show. And sure enough, 2 days before we were supposed to record the show, he sends this email. He's like, shit, I fucked up. I'm so sorry. He said, I can't have you on the show. And I was like, no, at that point I wasn't surprised. Kraft and Burger King had come to the agency and said, if he has Robyn on that show, we're pulling the accounts. I remember sitting across the table from him when he told me that, and we were just like, oh. He said, I'm quitting the agency. It has his name on it. He quit the agency he founded, and he said, my head and my heart were no longer connected to my mouth. And he left. He said, I can't do this anymore. 2 weeks later, we recorded that show. And no one had known until that point that he had a daughter that had had tumors that had been operated on when she was an infant. None of us can do this by ourselves. We have to find those friends that become part of that scaffolding around us that help us build into what we're supposed to be. It's why you guys are all here at this conference, to be around people that are going to shore you up and help you become what you're supposed to be. There's no way I could have done it without this guy. And courage is so contagious. So again, as an analyst, I knew correlation was not causation. And I mean, at that point with Burger King and Kraft and Monsanto and all these companies hating on me, they were trying everything they could to discredit the work that I was doing. And they would say things like, oh, well, Dr. Oz started his TV show in 1995 too. Is he responsible for GMOs? So I knew correlation was not causation, but I felt that a correlation of that magnitude, a 265% increase in the rate of hospitalizations related to food allergic reactions right at the onset of GMOs, that merited an investigation. And the question was really, how much of this stuff is safe? And as I was listening to her give this talk, again, it's like in science class as kids, you have those two beakers, two different ingredients, they're fine separately. When you pour them together, it suddenly combusts or bubbles or smokes or whatever. What were all of these things doing in combination? To my grandmother, to my sister who was pregnant, to my brother. And I realized in the US we were part of that study. So cancer came first. And the organic industry is so much like it was then in the United States, how it is right now in New Zealand today. I walked around the grocery store here in town earlier today and had a bunch of calls of people down here before I came down, and they said it's sort of like the organic ghetto, Robyn. It's like in the back corner of the grocery store. And I was in that grocery store countdown, and I thought, it is similar. Like, initially, it was just this one little category, this one little section. And once you were on board, you were just so psyched that there was even a section in the grocery store that was there. What changed in the United States was the retailers. We pushed so hard to get these big food companies to say, you know what, we're tired of this double standard. You're making better products overseas, bring it home. They fought. They poured millions into telling the consumer she was wrong. They lost. The group that won were the retailers. Companies like Kroger, Costco, which is coming to Auckland, they said, you know what, we're going to do private label. We know the consumer wants this. We're tired of waiting for these local companies to figure it out. And so they private labeled organic. Kroger went from 0 to $1 billion in revenue with their private label in a 2-year period, and it changed the industry. And then all of a sudden, the food companies that had been like sticking their fingers in their ears were racing to catch up. You look at childhood health and well-being ranked according to UNICEF. New Zealand's not on the list because it doesn't capture all of the data points yet. It's miserable out of 30 countries where the US falls. It's this complete disconnect with what we present to the world versus what's actually happening. So here's the opportunity for New Zealand. 80% of US consumers are purchasing something organic. In the US, because of cancer rates, it led with food. The spirits and wine and beverage industries are just starting to move in. In New Zealand, it's flipped. You're leading with wine. Less than 1% of farmland in the United States is organic. 75% of all categories in the grocery store have something organic, but less than 1% of our farmland is. We have 911 million acres, and only 6.5 million of them are organic. It's nuts. So as I talk to these companies and work with these companies, I'm like, where are you getting this from? Because we're not growing it here. The incentives aren't in place financially. Our government sure is not doing anything about it. And they said, for Applegate, they wanted non-GMO livestock feed. I said, where are you getting it? And she said, we have to import it from Australia, Uruguay, and Romania. And I'm like, that's nuts. Food security is national security. A healthy food system is a healthy population. It's so straightforward. And yet, there's risk here. There's enormous risk in the US. But that also means that there's enormous opportunity. When Monsanto sold to Bayer, they had extracted everything they could from our farmers. When they introduced that operating system of genetically engineered seeds and that portfolio of pesticides and fungicides and herbicides that go with it, it was a brilliant business model if you were Monsanto. Farmers couldn't save seeds anymore. You had a recurring revenue model for seeds. You also had trait fees, licensing fees, royalty fees that you could charge those farmers. And they charged and charged and charged those farmers until they met their earnings. So that they could hit their quarterly earnings number, they extracted from our farmers. And in the United States today, the median farm income is now negative $1,548. I believe Monsanto sold to Bayer because they had extracted everything they could from our farm economy. I was in Nebraska a couple of weeks ago, and the towns are literally papered up and shut down. Towns that had 4 high schools have consolidated into 1 with 3 neighboring towns. I don't know what happens to a country that can't feed itself. And it's both sides of the aisle. They get into this political fight around issues like this. And it made me think of this quote from FDR from way back. Conversations I had yesterday in New Zealand, it's again the same. The soil is not healthy. The soil is not healthy. How can you have healthy citizens if you don't have healthy soil? How can you manage water and irrigation and retention on a farm if the soil's not healthy enough to capture it? So it's been fascinating to watch the venture capital money come in. Silicon Valley gets really excited about operating systems. They get really excited about tech. In some ways, that's great because there are companies like Trace Genomics that are emerging, and there's some out of New Zealand, too, that we've been in conversations with this week, that are all about the data and capturing what's happening with the soil, measuring it, metrics. Farmers are already doing that. And in the United States, what's been fascinating is organic is a pretty politically loaded word. The guys that were growing all of Monsanto's stuff, they fought organic for 20 years. So they don't want to look like a hypocrite by converting. But what's been fascinating is the introduction, like Sebastian was speaking about, of regenerative agriculture. It's not the North Star that organic is, but it allows these farmers to participate. What is critical is giving people permission to participate. Saying you don't have to be perfect. Don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. Get on board. Start moving towards this. General Mills announced that they wanted to convert 1 million acres to regenerative agriculture back in March. They were hoping to get 25 farmers on board in the first 3 years. They heard from 180 farmers in the first 24 hours because the farmers knew that their soil health was suffering. So to speak to that issue, to speak to soil health, to speak to the economics of a farmer is such a successful way to go about this. Canada's doing it too. Peas and oats are 2 of the crops that the U.S. gets from Canada. A really good friend is the head of the Canadian Organic Trade Association. I reached out to him just before this trip, and I said, I'm coming to New Zealand. Give me your best. Show me what you guys are doing. And it's been fascinating. When the government gets out of the way, it's fascinating. But where you guys are right now is you actually need your government to implement that standard. New Zealand and Australia is the 2 only countries in the developed world that don't have one. It is kind of nuts. And I understand it, having come down here my entire life, I understand it because your food system was so much better than ours for so long. But in order to engage in that global trade and to participate in it, there has to be a definition. There's too much skepticism out there right now, and there's too much risk. So transparency is critical to moving this thing forward. I'll speak to some of these companies. I say, if transparency is a threat to your business model, you probably need a new business model. Because with blockchain and what's happening with digital disruption, it's coming. The times I've spent on farms in Iowa where each row of corn is labeled Syngenta, Monsanto, Bayer, it's so clear what they're growing. They know, the farmers know. I sat with those guys and I said, don't you think the moms want to know? Consumers want to know. There are handheld devices that are coming out right now that are getting all this venture capital money, and guess what they can do? They can also measure the allergens in a food, and they can measure the level of glyphosate. They can test for levels of pesticide. So this transparency is coming, and you can either be in front of it, or it's going to drag you behind. The challenge with blockchain is that I would venture to say that most governments are not that up to speed here. In working with different companies both in New Zealand and the US, that are talking about using blockchain and carbon sequestration and measuring that and creating these metrics and rewarding farmers for what they're already doing, which is capturing carbon in the soil. I'll ask, how's it been when you talk to the government? And they don't know, and especially in the US. They've aged out so much. They're so far removed from what's happening on a farm that they can't even begin to understand what this platform can enable. So I think about what we've done to our farmers in the US. Where you are right now as a country is where we just moved from. And what's happening right now is these farmers are waking up and they're advocating, and they're going to need you guys. They've used these pesticides for a long time, and it is so hard for them to acknowledge that. When I'm in Iowa, I say, where's the closest hospital? What are the nurses seeing? Birth defects. When we're in Nebraska, where's the closest hospital? 15 minutes away. What are the nurses seeing? Multiple sclerosis. There's so much that's hammering the farm economy around the world because we have not valued the farmer. We can go days or weeks or months or even years without seeing a doctor. None of us would make it longer than a couple days without a farmer. And yet we have not placed the value on that profession and on that livelihood. To me, it is one of the most important members of society. It is shocking to me that I go to this massive global food show every year and the farmers are not there. How in the world do we get through a day without them? So the opportunity is to flip the script. Not just in the food industry, but every single company should be thinking about these metrics. How can they participate? How can they educate their consumers? How can the consumers begin to demand change? Because the best movements start from the bottom. Jonathan was saying when he started this, he said the first time, we didn't even know if anybody would come. The first talk I ever gave, 6 people came. Have the courage to have the conversations. Have the courage to reach out to your local representatives. Have the courage to have those conversations with family members that are really hard to reach. Because the way I see it, and especially after listening to your presentation, the way I see it is that what we know here is a gift. And that same feeling you have when you have a gift to give to somebody that you love is that same feeling I have about this message. And if somebody's not ready to hear it yet, I just think I will hold on to this until they're ready to receive it. But it is a gift to know what we know and to hold on to it that way. So in the US, in the conversations I've had with these global companies, Nestle, General Mills, Danone, Hormel, Applegate, I said you cannot convert a food system on a quarterly earnings model. It takes 3 years in the US to convert from conventional to organic. How do you do that every 3 months when you have a quarterly earnings model? Wall Street isn't educated. They're measuring these guys on metrics from 1985 when the 21st century consumer is asking for free from food. Wall Street should be saying, what percentage of your farmland is organic? What practices do you have in place to convert it? What does the soil health look like? What are the metrics there? But they're not, because you can't fix a broken food system with a broken financial system. Capital is one of the most important ingredients on a farm or in a food system. And whether or not that capital is extractive or mission-aligned matters. So about a year ago, I put my head together with a couple of guys. One had been part of a private equity group. Another had been part of a RSF, Social Finance and Impact Investment Group out of California. And we thought, what would happen if we recreated a financial system here that actually put the farmer first? And what if we tapped philanthropic capital? And in the US, there is a category called donor-advised funds. It's $110 billion. You tap that capital. You marry it with technical expertise on the ground, eco-practices, trace genomics, these groups that are on the ground in farm country. and you work with these farmers who want to convert, and you bring in a guaranteed buyer, Danone, General Mills, Nestle, Costco, you get rid of that risk for that farmer. And that's what we're doing. In the United States, there is $409 billion of farm debt. The farm economy is about to absolutely collapse in on itself. The issue we have as a team is we can't move fast enough to be able to provide the capital to farmers to help them through this transition, to get them off of this toxic way of growing food into a healthier food system. So that's why I hope Jonathan will bring this conference to the U.S. He's honored the work that you do. It is an honor to be with all of you today, and I am so excited to listen and learn throughout the next few days of this conference. So thank you so much for having me.